Awesome. Okay, so there was a clock sitting right in front of my notes, and I couldn't read any of them. So good afternoon, and thank you guys for standing in front of me and letting me talk and put words in your direction. So I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on my notes today, because if I don't, I'm going to go off the rails and turn this into a 45-minute talk, and we don't want that. So I was asked to talk today about iOS user experience and how we got here and where we're going. Well, truthfully, I was asked to talk about my blog, Skew It, and give examples of people doing stupid things in user interface design. But I don't really want to do that. I want to talk about important things with you. Everything has already been said, but since nobody listens, it's necessary for us to say it all over again. This conference is about iOS, but to say that there's a divergence in design style is a new era is to ignore history. You see, the great thing about the simple questions, how did we get here and where are we going, is if we pay attention to history, we can find our answers. How? How can we find this way? Well, path dependence. Path dependence is where we are going, it's determined by where we're coming from. And we're going to talk about that today. It's in its simplest form. The path dependence determines that where we're going is determined by where we're coming from. So how did we get here? Well, looking back, it appears to me that there are two major phases of iOS development. First was just being there, establishing your existence. I was part of this first phase in building Mint's iPhone app. Our purpose was to meet an existing audience where they wanted us, on a device that they just likely purchased and barely knew how to use. We used mostly standard interface builder components and adhered diligently to the human interface guidelines, because every Apple app fit the mold, and there was no reason to create friction in this new experience. In fact, the apps that did at the time, those who chose to do something new, were ridiculed for being clumsy and often rejected by Apple. So I suppose in this way it was Apple enforcing path dependence, going from an old context to the new, and enforcing the path dependence on human interface guidelines, but it served the right purpose. So the second phase, where we are now, is in serving the best purpose for the target audience in a very crowded market. And that's about being best in class. So what does that even mean? How do we know what best is, and what class, the context, are we even talking about? Well, that's a lot harder. But we can reverse engineer the decisions of the apps we use, and not just try to understand their intent or say that they look stale or look good and they look dated or don't, but we can try to approximate the problems they were solving and see if those problems are still relevant in what we're building today. See, when we build something with explicit purpose, meaning we're designing, not doing art, our audience receives it and interprets its relevance on a spectrum of functional to experiential. And in trying to be the best fit for that audience, we have our estimation of where that is, and the audience has their estimation of where it should be. And so our goal in building and designing for them is to minimize the delta between those 2 points. Okay, so this is all basic, right? We say, sure, good design serves a purpose and does it efficiently with the least friction. But that friction comes from what we think of as a mismatch, a functional mismatch, when our expectations as a user do not match the interface we encounter. So how do we reduce that friction? Well, there's all this garbage in iOS design talk right now about how flat interfaces just get out of the way, or how skeuomorphism is tacky. This is the era of good design, minimalism. But this is just all a completely made-up conflict by tech pundits and outspoken people trying to engage their Twitter followers. See, this is not about flat design. This is not about skeuomorphism. It's about understanding the role of path dependence in user interface design, both as it pertains to bringing existing concepts to a new context, like books to a tablet, and as it pertains to the future decisions we make for continuing applications on those platforms. So we find ourselves now in this important conversation as designers, and it's very exciting. We're being present for the first major stylistic divergence on our new platform. But we can learn from the past instead of holding these dogmatic, hyperbolic views and simply parroting the arbitrary decisions of others, or arbitrarily parroting those decisions of others, because that's what got us into this whole realism mess and discussion in the first place. So why did we have such a strong presence of visual path dependence in iOS app design? Because we had a major context shift from the physical to the virtual, and we needed to take users along for the ride and reduce friction in touching a tablet. So reducing that experiential mismatch, if you will. But this has happened before, and we can learn from it. One of the most relevant eras of interface virtualization is that of audio production. In the late 1980s, it became clear that the capabilities of digital multi-tracking would disrupt the music industry. Early interfaces on desktops, very simple systems, attempted to minimize friction in context switching by maintaining path dependence, recreating the physical interface that these audio engineers were accustomed to with system components. So this was a functional match, benefiting from the user's spatial memory and knowledge of the convoluted visual language of the hardware. Many of these people had never even used a computer before and still didn't have them in their homes, but were comfortable enough using this new interface to continue making a living using it. So fast forward 10 years. 50% of homes have computers now. 10% of homes are making music on those computers in their homes. But the interfaces had not matured. They were still meant for composition and production based on the same decisions that we saw 10 years ago. They were dependent on the path set for them. They were rolling in new features slowly, but still carrying the old paradigms and still serving the same audience they did in 1991. So along comes Reason. It targeted that audience to say, this product is not like the others. That thing that you're using for making music isn't making music. It was for audio engineers. That $2,000 drum machine that you were about to go buy, you don't need to buy that anymore because we'll give you 10 of them for $300. And they rebelled with even more detail. They threw the pendulum back towards the experiential. And even though we didn't have multi-touch interfaces at the time, the cable elements had a physical response to mouse input. And so for anyone who had used this 10 years ago, this was amazing. These cables would swing around as you moved one jack to another, and it really felt like you had a virtual studio inside your computer. It enticed people to play, rewire, and truly interact with software as if it was a fully experiential virtual studio. So at the same time, a community had been growing around tools that shed complete ties to the physical studio, maintaining no dependence on hardware, drum machines, or any knowledge of the existing technology, and it focused on sampling and digital audio. So with no need to maintain aesthetic path dependency, we have our first major path divergence. So if path-dependent interfaces are those that take direction from the interfaces before them, divergence means breaking ties and creating new, deliberate decisions in contrast. This is also called path independence in economics, but I like using divergence here because it speaks to the action, not the state. So Ableton Live in 2001 adopted a completely flat UI to make a bold statement that you were not supposed to enjoy the experience of interacting with your computer's interface. You were supposed to enjoy interacting with your instruments and the content that you created with them. Your computer was there to be the brain, the organizer, and the recorder. They even went so far as to let you customize the entire color scheme of this, so the visual design of the application did not distract you from your goals as a creative musician. So while you might think that this sealed a trend of flat interfaces in audio software, a decade later, we now have maturity and diversity. Some choose functional minimalism. Well, we could say, hey, this is super clean. These guys must have the right idea, right? No, because this was designed with purpose to balance function with experience, letting a very simple interface belie extremely powerful, unexpected quality, greater than that of its extremely visually complex peers. And it shined through with much delight to the industry. So we say, okay, it's divergence. Do we always have to stand out against the crowd? Is that the answer? No, because purposeless, arbitrary divergence is not the answer either. Because at the same time, currently on the market, this software here, still one of the best in its class, has an interface meticulously detailed in Photoshop. That's not a photograph. And it's to not just match the interface of an Ampex ATR 102 mastering tape recorder, it's to match the exact interface of the actual refrigerator-sized unit in the workshop of the company that they used to model the effect. And it has even the scratches, the same remnants of Scotch tape from splicing on it. And it remains experiential in that what they're trying to do is convince us to believe everything here has purpose and function and convey the same attention to detail to the interface that they did in engineering the product itself. Now, understand, to buy the real-world counterpart of this would cost around $5,000, with about $1,000 a year in upkeep, if you could even find one on eBay. And now it's running off a USB key for $300. So it's critical that the experience here convinces those who've used the real ones and know how it should behave. So just like we're seeing in iOS, in a market saturated with irresponsible realism and a hypersensitive response to it, those focusing on matching the expectations of the user have shined through. Well, you might say, hey, that's a reel-to-reel, so that's okay, I can use a reel-to-reel in my applications. Well, where have I seen that before in user interface design? Why? In Apple's podcasts. So what's the purpose here? Well, we can only assume the purpose here is to show off the visual design talent of the team that made it. Or say, hey, look everybody, Dieter Rams. Or that I can tape ghosts in my basement with my iPad. I don't know. But the majority of people have no emotional response to this interface whatsoever. It maintains path dependency on a device that its audience hasn't just shed dependence, they probably never even encountered it. It suggests that I, who actually have used a reel-to-reel tape recorder in college, should expect functions and qualities I know to exist on a reel-to-reel, like record, which is not true, and it entices me to touch things that do nothing. This is why we have discussed for this type of interface and think that this is not a trend we should follow, because there's an experiential mismatch here. It's a mismatch of expectation, neither serving an experiential nor functional purpose to us. But in contrast, what does a match look like? What's a good match for us? Well, it looks like this. This is so functional that it doesn't even have a rewind button, because you likely don't need to rewind a podcast. You're just bored and want to skip to the next one. And in the same class, we could go fully experiential, and it looks like this. It's a bonkers drop shadow world interface that communicates the personality of the podcast it contains, independent of any path, even Apple's human interface guidelines. And its purpose is to emotionally connect, conceptually, and delight the user with the same esoteric creativity that we've come to expect from the content within it. Okay, so we return to purpose. What is the purpose of our design, and who does it serve? Well, just like Pro Tools made computers more familiar to audio engineers, Apple did the same for the general public with iBooks. What's the purpose here? To communicate the entire experience in a screenshot. It made the Kindle look like a calculator. Apple didn't have to win over other Kindle users. They had to win over people who believed they did not need an iPad. This single screenshot communicated the power and the friendliness of the device, not just for book readers, but for everyone. It represented transformation of a device. Everyone knew how to use iBooks just by looking at this. And even then, they knew how to use the iPad just by looking at this. This was path-dependent, but dependent on a physical artifact that had never existed in digital form this way. And just like we saw in musical interfaces 20 years ago, people started stealing the design, but not the thinking behind the design. And they were stealing the design, stealing the page curls and the corners, but they weren't stealing the reasons behind those. And who of all people stole the design without stealing the thinking behind it? Why was that dirty, no good Apple? Just like podcasts, we have a complete functional experiential mismatch. Path dependency on visual and interactive artifacts that the audience just didn't expect from this. And unlike podcasts, which at least attempted to make the interface conceptually cohesive, Apple just slapped a bunch of buttons and a scroll bar on a piece of paper instead of accepting that the functions that users already expected in a digital address book, those present in the plain, unexciting functional one that existed before, dictated a path for the interface independent of ties to a physical analog anymore. So how does one take meaningful cues from an existing product with a large audience overlap, but diverge from dependence on unnecessary, irrelevant visual artifacts? As Flipboard showed, they could capitalize on the path dependency of the interface paradigm of paging, but their assumption was that users who owned the device would already understand how to navigate their UI after learning their way around Apple's iBooks. So now, when we ask why about all these divergent decisions Flipboard made in context, we have a better approximation of the answers. And similarly, when we decide to put a product on the market and expect users to make a large conceptual leap to do something as simple as remember to pick up milk, we have to question whether or not we're making the right decision for that user base. And so the point that I want to leave you with is this. Path dependency is a guiding force in interface design. And understanding its relevance helps us know what's appropriate for our users and what isn't. We've been here before, and we'll be here again. But where we go is a response to where we're coming from now, making deliberate, functional, and experiential design decisions that make the most impact on our intended audience. The end.
Oh.
So here's the day for electronic snafus. Here, let's turn on the mirror.
All right, so my name's Michael Griffith. I'm the creative director with Bottle Rocket. And so actually yesterday you guys probably saw Calvin up here. Calvin and I are both Rocketeers at Bottle Rocket. So as soon as we're up and running here we go. All right. So my approach to this past, present, future thing and user experience is kind of taking a look at the past and seeing if we can recognize if there's any absolute truths around user experience that kind of can guide us into the future. And so I thought I'd do this through rock and roll. So rock and roll is a little bit of a passion of mine as well with design. So this seems to make sense. Hopefully it'll make sense to you. Looking at the history of rock and roll, this is Robert Johnson in 1929. Supposedly he went to the crossroads and sold his soul to the devil to be an awesome guitar player. And so thereby he defined the very first absolute truth of rock and roll, which was music. This rock and roll music is of the devil. And so the next thing that happened was this guy, Les Paul. He invented the electric guitar. And with inventing the electric guitar, he kind of defined the next absolute truth about rock and roll, which is play it loud. And so these are the things that are going to be sort of success criteria if you want to form a rock and roll band or you want to be a rock and roll star one day. So next came along, ignore that guy in the upper left, we'll talk about him in a second, but this guy over here is Sam Phillips, and he defined the third absolute truth of rock and roll, that it's really about making money, because he set up a label where he could sell these guys and make an incredible amount of money, which was Sun Records. So then this guy comes along, Elvis, and I'm sure you've heard the story. He when he was what television show was it? Ed Sullivan. So yeah, when he made the appearance there, they kept the camera above his waist because there was just too much movement going on below his waist, which let us know that sex is a big part of rock and roll. And then these guys came along, and it was more than just these guys. It was the whole British invasion. And so the Beatles came along, and then the Who, and then the Animals, and a bunch of other British bands, Yardbirds, Donovan, the Trogs. And really what this was about, this was crazy because we invented rock and roll here, and they stole it, and they did it better than us. And so that kind of let us know that, rock and roll has always been about a rip-off, whether it's, selling it to consumers or ripping off the people that came before you. So then this guy came along and stole it back. If you're not familiar with Iggy Pop, he has quite a reputation. He actually would smear his body in peanut butter and roll in broken glass, and he invented the stage dive. And so to me, he's kind of the grandfather of punk music. But where would those behaviors come from? Drugs. And so drugs is now probably a big part of rock and roll, unfortunately. And then these guys came along, and these guys broke the bank. And I don't know if you saw Jamie up here. She was wearing a shirt, a Sex Pistols T-shirt earlier, so I was silently cheering her on from the corner when I saw that. These guys really broke the bank when it came to all these absolute truths of rock and roll. So they just mixed it all together: sex, angst, drugs, rebellion, money, ripoff, hedonism, and hair. And this is where you started to see the hair go crazy. And so, this is all fine and good, but along the way, the things I didn't talk about is when rock and roll really got off track. And soon after these guys happened, it started to go off track again. And what happens when you start to stray from these absolute truths? Well, these are the Sex Pistols, Johnny Lydon and Sid Vicious, and you can see the hair they're sporting, and that was brand new at the time. But unfortunately, this guy came along, Flock of Seagulls, and he screwed up that haircut, and then that took another step to Michael Bolton, who invented this, what do we call this? The long and back mullet. So the mullet happened, and then the most horrible thing happened. This band, Starship, actually from this city, had 3 mullets in it, which caused them to create this song, We Built This City on Rock and Roll, which is the absolute worst rock and roll song ever. And so this is where it all went really, really wrong, because they weren't paying attention to what really made rock and roll. So let's think about that with user experience. And just to show how user experience can go off, or not so much user experience, but how even Apple can goof up. This is they call it the Molar Mac. And bonus points for anyone can tell me what year this came out. If you're a real Apple fan, you would know this. This was 98. And they called it, I would call it the iMolar, I guess, but it's the Molar Mac. This was right before the iMac, and you can see the top of it and how it's shaped. It's a really bizarre shape. This thing weighed 60 pounds. It was ridiculous, and it was only actually released in like schools for education and colleges and things. So they got off the rails and left behind those absolute truths of design when they built this, and it was a magnificent failure. But back to rock and roll. The good thing is Starship screwed up, and these guys saved rock and roll because they returned to those things that I was talking about, those absolute truths. And then it started to stray. You know, rap turned into models doing rap, which turned into models singing and winning Grammys that they weren't even singing. So, again, to get back on track, these guys came along, and they did an awesome job. And I think I don't know. Of course, I'm older, and so this is the last, they kind of invented some other aspects of rock and roll. I haven't seen anyone really rock like these guys rocked, and some things have gone wrong since then. To get to today, a bunch of stuff happened after these guys, and here's where we're at today. And this is like so far off the tracks that we really need to return to these things. So, if you do these things, if you adhere to this, you can be a rock star. And unfortunately, James Dempsey, there's nothing in here about data modeling, and so I think you've kind of capped your career as a rock star. But if you want to get back on track, realize it's the devil's music. It's for outsiders. It's a ripoff. It's the start of a rebellion. It's hedonistic. It's fueled by sex, angst, money, drugs, and it will likely change your hair. And it's really loud. If you adhere to those, you're going to be a rock star. So how can you be a user experience star? Let's review kind of a brief history of user experience. So you've probably seen this before, the first Apple computer. And what's weird, I looked at this morning. I've never noticed it. That thing up in the corner is actually an outlet, plugs. I'm like thinking, Apple, if they're holding back, if they invented a machine that you could plug it into itself for power, that's awesome. But I don't know what those are for. Anyway, so they invented this. And you guys know this story. So a bunch of stuff happened. You stood in line, you got an iPad, and we redefined user experience in a lot of ways. So here's the iPad that you walked out of the store with, and probably one of the very first apps you put on it was this one, which made you realize, I can build apps better than that. And I shouldn't pick on this too much. So this was actually an awesome app to demonstrate the hardware and what the hardware and software could do. From a usability perspective, never mind. So what are the absolute truths of user experience now that we've reviewed the history of user experience? I'm going to relate it to rock and roll because that's what I understand. So know your target. This is Art Chantry. He designed gig posters for a lot of punk bands and punk shows. And I saw him talk once, and he said something that has totally stuck with me. He called it advertising through exclusion, which really what he's talking about was doing things to appeal to a very small audience, and don't worry about everyone else. If everyone else wants on board, that's great. But here's an example of what he would do. So this band is The Cramps, one of my favorite bands, but a band I would not take my mother to. And so when you saw, so Art Chantry actually designed this gig poster, and it's hard to read. The readability is awful. It's very specific. When this is hanging on when it's duct taped to a lamppost or something, and you walk by this, you have to walk up to it and really look at it and read it to know what time the show is, where the bands are playing, what bands are going to be playing, and what bands are there, and all that stuff. You can't just see it from a distance and know and show up at the show. That's designed that way on purpose. My mother would never walk up to the lamppost and read this. We don't want my mother at this show. And so, but people who, like me, who are looking for these interesting things would actually go up there and digest the whole thing. So in design, can you start taking those things and applying those things to building apps? So I'm going to show some examples. I'll try to identify which ones we've done as Bottle Rocket and which ones we haven't. We did not do this one, but this is Turntable FM. Turntable FM knows their user. If you've used this app, if you're a music fan, what a music fan really want? You want free music. You want to be able to share it. You want people to recognize that you're turning them on to new music, so you credential those people that are showing new music. They've really grabbed onto it, and they've got this whole rating system, so you're a DJ up there, and you're getting thumbs up and thumbs down. They knew their audience, and what's interesting is it expanded outside of that audience as it grew, but it started with a really deep understanding of what makes music fans tick. Another absolute truth of user experience that I feel we should take advantage of is build things that are unique and ownable. And so when I'm talking about that, this is Tom Waits. Everybody knows Tom Waits, right? He's incredible. I don't even know how to describe his music. It doesn't fit into any one genre, and I think that's amazing. And so his wife once said that he makes two kinds of music, Grand Weepers and Grim Reapers. And if you know Tom Waits, that's pretty accurate. That's about the best description you could give of his music. If anyone else tries to sound like Tom Waits, they get called out for trying to sound like him. He has created something that's extremely unique and extremely ownable. And so, how does that get applied to an app? We did not do Flipboard either, but Flipboard, that folding thing that goes on, that's magic. And everyone's trying to steal it, and every time someone steals it, they get called out on it and said, oh, you're just using the Flipboard fold, That's amazing that you can create a unique and ownable thing on basically what we just used to think of as a transition, It's attention to those details that makes a huge difference. Change the way someone thinks about something. Obviously Apple is fantastic at this, but another guy that was pretty good at it was Andy Warhol. And so Andy Warhol has a great quote. Once you got pop, you could never see a sign again in the same way. And once you thought pop, you could never see America the same way again. Kind of a weird quote, but if you think about it, it is pretty amazing because he redefined what we think art is. He also redefined what we think music is, or at least he tried. This band is the Velvet Underground, which pretty much everybody agrees was awful, and most of their records were bought by themselves, but but it was an attempt. And he did change the way people thought about music, and they influenced a lot of other bands moving forward. And so thinking about that, how can you present things in a different way? And I know this isn't necessarily UI-based or UX-based, but it's more content-based. But I think it's a great example. This is the Civil War app that Bottle Rocket did. And one of the greatest pieces or parts of this is this chunk here where a day in the life. And so I can selectively, so I should back up and say every day content is released as if you're in that day of the Civil War back in time. So you can read about a day in the life of Abraham Lincoln, which you probably saw in textbooks to some extent. But you can also read or dive into a day in the life of a soldier's wife whose husband has gone off to war. What a really unique and different perspective. And how would you change the way someone thinks about the Civil War? Present it in those terms. Another absolute truth of user experience. Build a focused and guided experience. And I actually think that this is, remember Ken yesterday talking about simplicity? This is the same difference. So one of my other favorite bands, Devo, and one of my favorite Devo quotes, freedom of choice is what you've got. Freedom from choice is what you want. Sounds weird, but think about that. When you're presented with a million choices, you can't make a choice. When you're presented with fewer, and he gave the example of, the 4 models of Apple versus the 50-some of Dell, I think it was. I think this is a really important point. And so how does that translate to an app? I don't think that the TED app is a beautiful app or amazing as a user experience, but there's one element that's absolutely amazing, and it's the Inspire Me button. And if you do that, you guys can barely see this. It says you want something, and that list on the left is adjectives. And we're talking about how important words are and just single words or a few words. These words are all kind of branded words. Like, do you want to see something fascinating? beautiful. Those aren't the normal words. Usually you have categories like, do you want to see something fiction, nonfiction? These are words that actually start to define what you want to see, and then it says, and then the next screen asks you how much time you have. Really, if you think about this, that is just a search engine. That's all it's doing, is it's matching those tags to this thing. Instead of returning the results in a big list, it returns it, here's only 3 videos. We know there's probably 1 billion videos that actually fit that description, but it just gave me 3. It feels finite, it feels great, and the one that, it feels like it's curated and special, and it is. It's just thought of in a different way. But again, it's not much more than a search, right? Another absolute truth of user experience. I'm going to pick on Led Zeppelin for this one, but create something immediately familiar. This gets me in trouble sometimes. I think Led Zeppelin was the greatest cover band to ever live, and that's actually a pretty good compliment, but they probably wouldn't want to hear that, and they don't fess up to it. But if you really look at their lyrics and a lot of what they did, they took it somewhere else, but it's stolen. And where was I going? Oh, so building something familiar. So this is, we did build this. This is part of the 106 in Park app. 106 in Park is a show where you actually vote on the top 10 videos of the day. Well, what's the easiest way to do voting? Probably put together a list view and just tap on the one that you want to vote for. And what we did was, let's make it a record scratch. And so my votes are actually how many times I can scratch the record, like back and forth, in 4 seconds, I think it is. So we presented it, though, on a turntable. And when you see this, you immediately want to touch that record player. You've been presented with something that you know to do something completely new and different, and you're immediately engaged. This was so much fun. Oh, and this last one shows how like the yellow's creeping up behind it. That's how many scratches. So that's going up while you're scratching. This was so much fun that they actually have kids come up on the stage at 106 in Park and actually compete with each other to see who can get the most votes. All right. So really quickly, let the user define the app. This is the Ramones. The Ramones, those are the Chuck Taylor Converse tennis shoes. They didn't define, obviously those were basketball shoes, probably the worst basketball shoes ever invented, but the punks started wearing them. And then the cheerleaders started wearing them, and the nerds started wearing them, and they totally embraced it. They didn't say, you can't wear those because you're not a basketball player. Think about that with apps. How do you make that happen with apps? Pinterest. And I'll be embarrassed to admit, I'm a guy, and I have a Pinterest account. But you can use this for whatever you want. It's up to you to define the use and what it's for. And so, whether I just want to document the beers I drank at South by Southwest or I want to collect pictures of wedding gowns, I can do either one in that app. That's cool. The app is the device. And so Rick Wakeman is an amazing keyboard player, but his career was capped by the fact that he was trying to turn a guitar into a keyboard, and this whole keyboard thing, that's not rock and roll. And so because it got abstracted, the keyboard just doesn't work that way. And so, thinking about an app that works and that becomes the device, or the device becomes what it is what is this, Scorekeeper? If you've seen it, so I can add my name to it. I can add other people's names to it. And all I can do is just keep score. That's all it does, but it doesn't tell me how to do it or what I can define it myself. And the whole thing now becomes a scoreboard. So you can see I'm winning. Nipsey Russell is in second place. And the bad news is that Iggy Pop is beating your mom. Personal device assumes personal relevance. And so just like mixtapes you would make for your girlfriend, they didn't make sense to anyone else, but they made sense to your girlfriend. Build apps that way. So, this is my phone when I first bought it. This is my phone 2 minutes later. I take a picture of my cat and I use it on the screen. It's my phone. It lives in my pocket. Everything on it should be about me and for me. Here's examples. I've got pictures of weird things I do to my cat. I've got pictures of my doodles. I've got pictures of where I parked my car. Those are very personal things. Apps can do the same thing. So, Flipboard does a great job of pulling personal relevance into, the screens there. Apps are about the here and now. So, the web is where everything lives forever and ever. And if you want to sort through all that stuff, that's great. But just like Madonna, who reinvented herself every day, and she was about the moment, it's the same thing. I feel like it's the same thing with apps. And a great example of that is Entertainment Weekly. This is only published once a week, and it's only 10 things, and it's their 10 things, and then I have to wait till next Sunday for the next batch of 10 things. I can't search through it. I can't go through the whole archive. I can back up to last week's or go to the week previous, but I can't jump back to a specific date. That's okay. That's a cool experience. That's what makes it way different than a website. All right, so if you're going to form a UEX band and you want success, these are the things that you just need to do. If you do these things, it's going to be successful. I've worded them a little differently there, but it's the same difference. And so that makes me think about the future, and it's impossible to predict what the future is. I would say, if you adhere to these, you don't even need to worry about what the future is and where things are going. If you apply these, basically, to get back to rock and roll, you guys know where this came from? Spinal Tap? So this is an amplifier that goes up to 11 rather than 10, so it's louder than the amp that goes to 10. And I think that's what the future is kind of about is, there we go. The future is no different. It's just louder. Just take those principles I talked about and blow them out further and further. Make an app that's more personally relevant than the app you made last week. Take all those things and just push them further, and I think that's what the future is all about. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. And I apologize because I messed up the technology stuff up here. We don't have any time for questions. Let's take about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back for the next presentation at 3:05. Thanks again.